We are, let's see. Oh, we have lots of people who are giving us, we have Denmark, we have Alaska, we have West Virginia, New Mexico, we have another Alaska, we have an Austria, we have Tromsø, we have California, lots and lots of places. Iowa, I see many places across North America, but equal amounts of Europe. So thank you for joining us at the end of your workday. We appreciate you being here. Again, for those who just joined us, hello. My name is Victoria Herman. I will be moderating this webinar today. We'll be getting started in about 1 minute. We're just waiting for a few more people to join us now. And I ask if you are just joining us to make sure that you are on mute so we can hear the incredible presentations that we are about to hear. And again, we are putting in the chat where you are so we can see all of the great places that are on the Zoom, because while we can't be all in one place, it's pretty incredible that we can be on this virtual space together despite being across the world. So I think we have a good group now and we'll get started. Hi again. My name is Victoria Herman. I am the Managing Director of the Arctic Institute, and we have two incredible speakers today as part of our Breaking the Ice webinar series. And as a reminder, this is part of a now 15 webinar series that bring together over 20 women across the Arctic to share their experiences, their expertise, their research with all of you. And at the end of this webinar, I'll be sharing some of our upcoming events that I hope to see you at. But also, if you are interested in presenting at one of these webinars, this is an open invitation. We want to be as inclusive as possible and to uplift as many of your research experiences and expertise as possible. So if you are interested in presenting yourself, we'll also be sharing the link for you to express your own interest. Today, we have two presenters, and I will be handing it over to our first presenter in just a moment. I ask that if you have any questions throughout either presentation for our speakers, to please put them in the chat box. I will be monitoring that chat box throughout the presentations, and we will have a robust question and answer session after each of our speakers. So if you have questions for our first speaker while she is speaking, please put those in the chat, and I will connect with you to ask you to come on afterwards to ask your question. If you have any technical difficulties, you can make sure to direct message me, and we will make sure to get you all sorted. And finally, if you are having difficulty staying on this Zoom, I will be sharing the live stream link in the chat, which is often easier to listen to, and you can still ask questions through that link. So if you are having trouble and getting kicked off because of low broadband, you will have that alternative to still listen to our presenters. All right, that is enough from me. So I am going to hand over my virtual mic to our first presenter, Charlene Apek-Apok, who is originally from White Mountain and Golovin, Alaska, and has served in many spaces as an advocate for Indigenous sovereignty, women, climate justice, and Indigenous rights in health and well-being. She is a lifelong learner of both her cultural traditions and decolonizing academia. And today she is incredibly gracious in sharing how Indigenous peoples have taken leadership to reclaim and steward data to support self-determination efforts towards justice. So I am going to spotlight and hand over my virtual virtual mic to further introduce yourself to our participants today.
Koyana, Victoria, can you all hear me okay? Yep. All right, well, Paglavici, that means welcome in my language. What an honor to have folks from all over joining us today. I'm going to be sharing about some work happening up here in Alaska from an organization where I'm the co-founder and founder of and executive director at Data for Indigenous Justice. Ovanga Charlene Apak Ganubak Siska Akpik, Chinik Mu Gurunga Suli Nachirvik Mu Gurunga, Akaga Sandra Baby Lu Apak, Ilknega Evan Luklan, Savaktunga Data for Indigenous Justice Me. So good morning and welcome. My name is Charlene Apak and my Inupiaq name is Akpik, which is salmonberry or cloudberry. My family is from Golovin in White Mountain, Alaska. My mother, Sandra Baby Lu Apak, and I have a 6-year-old son, Evan Luklan. And I'm an Inupiaq language learner. And I also am a singer and dancer as part of a Kingakmute dance group as well. So a little bit about my Inupiaq heritage and who I am and where I'm from. Before I jump into the presentation, I wanted to acknowledge that as we talk about data and especially the topic that I'll be sharing about with missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, one, I just want to pause and share with the audience if you need to take a break or mute or sign off for a moment. Sometimes it can be hard if this is triggering when sharing about violence that's happening in our communities. And also because we recognize when we talk about data and research in this topic area that we're talking about very human, real people, real women that we're missing in our lives. And so I just wanted to acknowledge that before proceeding. So again, if this is a hard topic or anything like that, I just wanted to share that first before really going into it. And also acknowledging because many times as we talk about research and data, it can feel turned off. Sorry, that's my son. The speaker turned off. Lukon, you're gonna have to wait, please. No. Okay, apologies. Still at home, being safe. But again, I just wanted to share that these are real loved ones and real people as we go ahead and talk about numbers and data. The next thing I wanted to share is recognizing my board at Data for Indigenous Justice. And so this work is really led by Indigenous women, very much in theme with this Breaking the Ice Ceiling webinar series. So I wanted to recognize some of the amazing women that I work with. Jody Potts on the left has a background in law enforcement and she resides here in Alaska. Abigail Echohawk is at the Urban Indian Health Institute in Seattle, Washington. And their organization had put out the first national report on this for the US for missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And then Dr. Malia Villegas serves her tribe and she has a policy background and had previously worked at NCAI here in the US. So I just wanted to acknowledge that I'm the only one presenting today, but that again, this is an Indigenous women-led effort. Next, for Data for Indigenous Justice, I just bullet pointed some of our founding principles and our purpose. And this is part of the efforts to decolonize and reclaim data that we really think is important to share out, especially in the space of research, that we do this work by stewarding and caring for data, and we do it with intentions to serve and benefit our people. And that acknowledging the past harms of research and within our Indigenous communities has sometimes been very harmful, and that it's really important that we're reclaiming and self-determining research for ourselves. I also want to acknowledge that Data for Indigenous Justice is part of a working group here in Alaska, and that there's other organizations that we partner with very closely to address this crisis that's happening up here in Alaska. And that, again, with it being led by Indigenous people, it's really coming from a healing-centered way. So oftentimes when we do research or when we are doing work on the front of justice, it's exhausting. You know, it's a lot of work, but we really do this work in a healing-centered way. We do it with our community. And some of the pictures here you'll see pre-COVID, of course, where we were able to gather and bring our people together. We did drumming together there in the center. We did beading workshops on the right-hand side. We've done painting sessions. And we've brought community together for resolutions and bills and legislation and things like that as well. So I just want to emphasize how much we're guided by our people and with our community, and that we acknowledge doing this in a healing way so that we aren't causing harm when we do this work. All right, so where were we at a couple years ago in 2018? So in 2018, the Urban Indian Health Institute put out a report that shared this data on the right-hand side, where you'll see Alaska has the 4th highest cases of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And that was with sheer number of cases. So this is just not per population or anything like that. But with sheer number of cases, we had 52 documented. And then you'll see the other states here as well. And within that, Anchorage, the city up here in Alaska, the largest city, we had was the 3rd highest for this report, where we had the most cases in the nation as a city. And so that's where we were at just in 2018. And we know, though, from our families and our communities and our experiences and people who have been speaking out, that though that number is very high, we knew that there were more. So from that point on, we've been homing a database here in Alaska, and it started from a grassroots effort. And we can share more about that story later if you wanted to know more about that. It's also in the report that I'll be sharing a little bit later. But from this time period on, we started homing and tracking our own database, which is actually that picture on the left is a map of cases here in Alaska that we started doing in 2018 to start tracking our own. And so it really started from the community giving us the names and recording them and keeping track. And the reason for that, I'll share on the next slide. And as that report in 2018 also pointed out, was that there was no buddy tracking. So when we went to organize and draw attention to this here in Alaska, we wanted to read the names of our loved ones, and we found that there was no tracking. We couldn't pull it from law enforcement. We couldn't pull it from the state. We couldn't pull it from any agency because they were not tracking data accurately. And so we started to do that, and we founded Data for Indigenous Justice to home and care for that database so that we can reclaim our data. So what are some of the ways that we were reclaiming data? And this will also partially answer where were the data gaps and why is this happening? For the sake of time, I didn't put in some of the overarching problem slides and how we got here today, but I will briefly share, the people often ask, how long has this been happening? How many, how has this been happening? And really, this has been happening since contact. It's been happening since colonization here in Alaska, which was much later than in the lower 48 of the United States, but nonetheless, we've had incredible impacts of trauma and lots of rates of violence. And there's so much research on rates of violence that's not necessary to really share that. And really what we're trying to share is our stories of reclaiming who we are in our from our own voice and our own narrative. And so I didn't put those slides in today, but in short, I think people are aware that there has been lack of accountability for law enforcement, particularly in the United States, and that includes here in Alaska, and that there is so much need for justice in the justice system. So again, I didn't put the slides there for the sake of time, but because of those reasons, it's led to a data gap. And again, we weren't able to pull it, and we weren't able to have this data. And so we started doing it ourselves. And this is how we started doing it. And this is really what I like to share, is the proactive and solutions-based ways that we're organizing as Indigenous people and self-determining our own data in research. So this is more of the exciting things that I like to share about our work. So some of the mechanisms that we've reclaimed data is through the Freedom of Information Act request, often called the FOIA request. And on that top left, you'll see kind of a screenshot of what that looks like, but essentially it's a portal requesting state data that should be publicly available. Oftentimes, for example, one of the first batches of data that we were able to reclaim was a cold case unit up here in Alaska with the state troopers. They had a website that had 101 cold cases, and they said that there were these cold cases, but we didn't know the names of who they were, and we didn't know anything about it, and hence the public couldn't give information or share tips or be able to be a part of having those cases solved. So one of the things that we did was we flooded the FOIA request after, well, first we tried to do it just by having requests, like my own individual request, and we got denied frequently. And so then we flooded and had many people, including tribes, fill out the same request. And we had over 40 requests for the one piece of data around cold cases. And then we were finally given our own data and our own information. And then the other ways that we reclaim data is working with a federal database here in the US called NamUs. We also use social media as a really powerful tool. There's missing persons Facebook pages here in Alaska, and that one you'll see with that green ribbon is called Seeking Alaska's Missing. And then uniquely, we do partner with law enforcement. So we started to develop relationships with law enforcement so that they would get to know us as people and be able to actually have these relationships to work together. And that's been very helpful as well. And then last, I want to acknowledge here on this box about race, we've all seen, no matter what country you're from, probably, we see these boxes of race and ethnicity where it's very limiting and doesn't encompass truly who we are. But this is very common in the United States and here in Alaska. It originates from the census. And these are the boxes which categorize our people. And because of the limited boxes and collapsing of data, we often lose our people in that data. So for example, if you are of mixed heritage here on this box and you only select that you're white, for example, but you are Alaska Native, it gets collapsed and we lose that designation of Indigenous people, and hence we lose that designation in data. There's many other issues to the point on race and ethnicity and other demographic categorizations that I can share about. It's also in our report that I'm going to share about next, but it's just one example of how we were missing in data and how we reclaim that data. So since Data for Indigenous Justice was founded, as I mentioned, we started homing and tracking our own data from 2018 to present. And in February of this year, so just 2 months ago, we released the first Alaska-specific Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls report. And if you recall on that previous slide, we had 52 cases. And at that time, 52 cases was the fourth highest state in the United States. Since we've been reclaiming and tracking our own data, we have 229 cases of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls just here in Alaska. 149 are as missing and 80 as murdered. And so these numbers are staggering. And again, as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, these are the real lives and real people and loved ones that we are missing. The other part that I want to share about this report and these figures is that this is just, quote, the tip of the iceberg, so to speak. So for example, one of the cross-referencing of data that I've had even since February, just 2 months ago, is a 10-year poll that I'm getting from a local law enforcement agency that I will cross-reference. So this number, though very high, again, is just the beginning of us tracking. And the other thing that I want to say about this figure and how we know it's low is because of our stories in our community, but also because most data isn't digitized. And so again, even for law enforcement to pull it, it's unavailable. And so we're hurdling many barriers to data, and we're reclaiming it slowly, and changing legislation. And we're taking a multi-pronged approach to this issue, and this is just the data piece. But we know that research and data is important for things like informing policy, making decisions, and things like that. And that's why this report was so significant for Alaska. The report can be found at dataforindigenousjustice.com, and we can maybe put that in the chat for you. And so this was the first data that we were able to have. So again, this is our efforts up here in Alaska to reclaim data to address missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And so what it looks like when Indigenous people are gathering their own data and using it to serve their own people is very different. And so this is us decolonizing data and having data sovereignty to benefit our people. And I'm happy to answer questions about any of these areas, whether it's the demographics, the report, what community engagement looks like, some of the policy efforts that are happening. There's, again, depending on the audience, you all might be interested in different areas. So I kind of high-pointed information, but I am happy to answer any questions to the best of my ability on any of these things. I just kind of gave a high-level overview, really just to see where you are more interested in hearing more about and how I can answer questions for you. So Koyanakbuk, and I'll stop sharing my slide and we can answer some questions.
Thank you so much. And if everyone could please join me in giving a huge round of applause. Thank you for such an amazing presentation, one that gave us a really wonderful overview. And I think a lot of avenues for questions. As a reminder, if you have questions, please put them in the chat. You can also go down to the participant icon and raise your hand if you would like to come on so that I could unmute you and bring you on to the screen. So as participants are getting their questions ready, I do wonder if you could maybe speak a bit about that community engagement point and maybe just shed a bit more light on what that looks like and yeah, from your own experiences, but also maybe things that those who might be interested in the approaches, what has worked, what hasn't worked. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, thank you for asking. Again, I wasn't quite sure. I didn't want to put too many slides in, but I do have a slide on like upcoming events and how we organize in partnership with that working group. So what that community engagement often looks like is we have so many events, and we know that, you know, our approach isn't just to like be putting out fires. You know, we're really trying to heal and provide a safe space for our people on this topic. And so I shared a little bit about the gatherings, but some of the other things that we've had, for example, are 5Ks. In last September, we did it virtually, adapting to COVID. And we had over 500 people register for that event and participate in a virtual 5K. And we even had international participants. So again, the initial intent was just to do it for Alaska, but then people participated across the US and internationally. And that was really important. And that was to raise awareness. And then we've also do things like beading sessions. We do Indigenous women's gatherings, again, usually in person, but now we've moved to virtual. And we've had art shows. We've also done things like the resolution, where we had a recognition from local law enforcement. And then there's areas like policy. I wouldn't call it community engagement, but we have worked together in our working group to write and draft bills and things like that. And we often invite our community members to, of course, testify and share on that. So it's looked like many different things, and we like to share that out because we encourage other communities who are facing this issue, because we know this isn't happening in a vacuum. We share that out so that communities can also take their own initiative, and we're happy to share all of those ideas so that they can do it too.
Thank you. And with that point on policy, we do have a question. And this participant asks, for policies, what are the most meaningful, and have you had trouble at the local or state level in passing policies?
All of the above. So yes, I guess I'll start locally. So in that picture where we had community engagement and we were passing the local resolution, that was a pretty big deal. So something unique about here in Alaska is that we have 220 federally recognized tribes, so recognized by the United States. But here in Alaska, the state does not recognize our tribes yet. So what that looks like is often having to use federal level government to government relationships and leveraging that, because the state does not honor the sovereignty of our tribes here. And at the local level, what that also means is that they are not required to recognize and do government to government relationships. So what we often get, for example, when we first started meeting with the municipality, the city, law enforcement, the initial response was, we can't have any kind of special work with your group, because then it would mean we'd be treating you differently, and you know, all of that kind of response, universality and stuff like that. And so my response was, well, and we're seeing disproportionate impacts of our community in the data from your agency, and until I see that change, I'm not going to stop asking. So again, after building some relationship locally, we were able to get that resolution passed around missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And then significantly as well, we were able to get a recognition passed at the Alaska Federation of Natives. And that was also a pretty big deal, because that's an organization that has a lot of policy leveraging. So at the state level, it was pretty, they seem like small milestones, but they really mattered a lot because we don't have that recognition locally and at the state. We do have some bills drafted the last couple of years that haven't passed yet. And again, we have some in legislation right now to address this issue. And so we'll see if they get passed. And some of the things that we ask for are for data required, mandated data reporting. You would think we wouldn't have to ask for that, but we do. And then we've also asked for different accountability to the different kinds of law enforcement we have here in Alaska. So again, those are kind of in the works. Parallel to the bills around missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls is we are also trying to get our tribes recognized here in Alaska, and that's a big push as well. So that's in legislation currently too. And then at the federal level, there's been some really important bills passed that you may have heard of, Savannah's Act and the Not Invisible Act. And these are really important, and I'm so glad that they have been passed. We have a little bit of time, I guess, to see and have them actually realized at the state level here in Alaska. But they do provide some important avenues that tribes can take at the federal level for data sovereignty. So for example, at the federal level, they are going to be required to start having data. And what it means for tribes here in Alaska is that they can choose to use the data that the federal agencies are pulling, but they also are able to have support for self-determining their own data and their data fields. And again, they are pretty, quote, new and haven't quite trickled down yet here in Alaska to see the impacts, but they do provide opportunities for tribes to be creative and start collecting their own data in their own way. So.
Thank you. That was a lot of complexity in it.
Yeah,
but it was a great answer. It gave so much information despite just how many layers there are and how much you were working on from the local to the federal.
Yeah, there's a lot to each of these, and that's why I really tried to just high point and see where people wanted to talk more. Policy is a whole nother wheelhouse that, the data supports. And we always, there's so much happening on the community level. So I'm so thankful for the questions because each of these is a very complex area.
And maybe to add a little more complexity, we do have a question if you work with Canadian groups on the same issues we are facing.
Oh my goodness. Thank you so much for asking. So I do want to honor and recognize all of the work that Canada has been doing even before 2018. I think that first report for Canada was 2016, if I recall. And their initiatives for, on the global level were really important to bringing to light the issues that we face as Indigenous people. And so it would be absolutely remiss of me to not acknowledge the work that's happening in Canada. I don't have any direct partnerships with Canada right now, but we do, look at their work, and they've been leading the way for us. And then having the Urban Indian Health Institute be able to put out that national report in 2018. And then for us as Alaska to have our first report just this year, I mean, that really matters, and it's a big deal. I do have one of my community-based projects here at Data for Indigenous Justice is building a canoe together with our community as a healing event where we're dedicating a canoe next month to missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And we have gotten donations from Canada because of, these are invisible borders, because of shared cultural values around canoes. And so actually we recently got an amazing donation to help support our canoe project. So in some ways, we look to Canada and have learned a lot from their leadership. And then, I know that I have felt support from our relatives over there. We don't have any direct organizational partnerships like formal, but I do recognize all of the work that's been happening over there.
Thank you. And I will ask afterwards for a few of these links so that I can share them in the follow-up if others would like to support your work or learn more, so that, yeah, we can share far beyond the short amount of time we have here.
Absolutely.
So I think we have time for one or two more questions. So again, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. We do have one question from the live stream, so I'll ask that one, and then we might transition to our second speaker. So this one is about youth engagement. How do you engage girls in your work? And do you have any programs that uplift youth leadership in data sovereignty?
Yes, excellent question. And this is an area of opportunity for growth. So one of the things that we do have is, and besides the board, I have an advisory board that's made up of community members, elders, healers, and that has a space for a youth person as well, and then tribal leadership. There has been a lot of youth engagement through the community events, and then some of the things such as that are coming up, like the 5K and things like that. The other parts that we are trying to build a narrative around, I guess for a lack of better words, is we're trying to raise awareness, particularly with young girls, around, quote, cyber safety. Sadly, and so right now we have some a comms kind of virtual memes and things like that that we're trying to put out around, pardon me, look on. We're trying to put out awareness for young people, because sadly with many of the cases with young people, it started with inappropriate messaging that got out of hand. And so what we're trying to do is to really shut down those kinds of unsafe conversations that have literally led to being human trafficked into the city. And so that's an area particularly that we're gearing towards young women and girls. And then also, again, some of the healing events, one of the things we have planned and that we've done the last 2 years is self-defense. And we know that just teaching self-defense doesn't get to the core issue of this, but nonetheless, it's important. And so we've had self-defense webinars and trainings, and we're doing another one. We have 2 more scheduled this year. And again, that's geared towards young women for their safety. And then we have a collaboration through Native Movement and some other orgs here in Alaska that we're hoping to do some things like yoga and healing and wellness, again, to really nurture and protect and provide skill sets to our young women. So it looks like many different things. For research and data, mentorship is really important to me. And so oftentimes we get lots and lots of questions from students who are like, how can this be, I've met with someone, they wanted to do their practicum on this. And I was like, absolutely. So I always try to meet with students who are passionate about this area. And so oftentimes students will want to do a project. And I was once that student who was asking people, could you meet with me? So I always try to say yes to that because it's so important. And I know it meant a lot to me as I was going through academia as well. So I guess one last thing, and I'm trying to not take up too much time, but because this is a sensitive area, what I want to clarify with youth and girls is I don't particularly reach out and say, hey, do you want to work on this? I kind of wait for them to be ready because it's such a heavy topic. It can be tolling for young people. And so I'm just really mindful of making sure that they're healthy and well to do this work and that it isn't harmful for them to participate. And so there's kind of a fine line of wanting to engage them, but also making sure that it doesn't add any kind of harm or burden to young people. So both and.
Both and. That is a good way to put it. And thank you, yeah, both for your answer and for all of that work. I am looking and am not seeing any additional questions, and we are about halfway through our time. So I am again going to ask everyone to join me in giving another huge virtual round of applause. Thank you so, so much for being so generous with your expertise, with your experiences, with all of your knowledge around what you were doing and sharing that with us. So thank you so much for your presentation and for being here with us. And
Diana.
And I will be in our follow-up email sharing a few additional resources if you want to continue learning and supporting some of the things you've learned about on this webinar or the recording. So please look for that. We are going to now transition to a slightly different topic where I am going to introduce our second speaker, Dr. Aviaya Leibrecht-Hauptmann, who is an Inuit Greenlander microbiologist, PhD in microbial microbiomes. She is a public speaker and a member of the Greenland Research Council. Her presentation today is going to talk about using science as a tool to understand rather than create knowledge and facts. And she will be giving an Indigenous female perspective on reductionist microbial research. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over my virtual mic to listen to our second wonderful presentation today. And again, if you have questions, please put them in the chat and we will go into a robust question and answer after the presentation.
Thanks so much, Victoria. I have to say my internet is not too stable. So if you could help me and let me know if I fall out too much so that I can pause. Yeah, thank you. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. I also want to give a huge thank you to Akbik for the incredible work that you do and for being here today and sharing this work with us. It's very inspirational. And I feel honored to be coming after you, but we are going to move into a very different topic now. So I hope that the participants are ready for a slightly different topic now. Before I introduce myself further, I just want to make sure that everyone knows the place that I'll be talking about. So this is Skelettlinunat, Greenland, and this is the focus area of my talk today. Greenland was colonized by Denmark exactly 300 years ago this year. And since the 1950s, Greenland has gone through several steps of increased independence. And today, Greenland is a self-governing nation within the Danish realm. And the population of Greenland is only about 56,000 people. And of those, the majority are Indigenous. We are Inuit, and the minority is mostly Danes from Denmark. So this was just very briefly about Greenland. And I also want to just tell you a little bit more about who I am. My name is Aviaya. I am a biologist. I was trained as a biologist with focus on microbiology from the University of Copenhagen. Through my studies, I focused on applied microbiology and biotechnology. And after finishing my studies, I went for a PhD at the Technical University of Denmark, where I started working with metagenomics, so looking at microbes, microbial DNA through computer-based methods. And after finishing my PhD, which had a focus on snow and ice environments, I wanted to work with something that was a little bit closer to people, something that might be of greater interest to my community in Greenland. So I started focusing on our traditional foods, looking at the microbes in traditional Greenlandic foods. And that's sort of the professional side of me. This is more of the, what you could call the personal side of me. I'm just going to move this. Like this. I was born and raised in Greenland. I'm Inuk, and I'm also Danish. I have a husband and 2 sons. And the theme of this talk is very much how I've changed a lot in the recent years, so that my research now includes a lot more of the perspectives from both of these sides, not just the professional me, but also who I am as a human being, as an Inuk person, and as a mother and as a woman. So allowing these things to merge and be meaningful to the research that I do. So the ice ceiling that I want to talk about today is an ice ceiling that I see, at least in Arctic research. And this ceiling is the fact that we in the Arctic have been the focus of research, at least in Greenland, for 300 years. And today, with the changing climate and all of these things, there's even more research about the Arctic, about our environment, about us as human beings, about our societies. So with all this research, you should think that we would have a really prosperous society, that everything would be amazing because we've created so much knowledge about who we are, how our environment works, and what doesn't work. So we should have been able to change some of these things and created really successful societies, if you can call it that. But we have issues like what Akbik told us about before in the Arctic, both environmentally, but also human issues that haven't been solved by all of the research that has been done. And I think a lot of that is because it's not important how much research is done. It's important how we do that research. So what I think we need to do, as Victoria also mentioned, is that I think we need to move from a point where we do research to create knowledge and to create facts to a point where we create research that fosters understanding. And I have a belief, at least, that we do that through creating research, creating facts and knowledge that is in the right context, where you know and understand the context so that those facts can create a bigger understanding. And why is it that we need to do this if it's not obvious? I believe that is because when we have understanding of things, when research creates understanding, this is what can create positive, relevant change. This is where we go from just a lot of research to research that actually changes things in better directions in our communities, in our environment. And how do we do this? I think to create understanding, we have to go away from at least in science, the field that I'm in, we have to go away from thinking in silos and thinking in our own disciplines only, and breaking down those barriers and include other disciplines, try to understand other disciplines as part of our research, but also break down barriers between academia, science, education, and the rest of the community, because it is in the community that the understanding can be found, and that can guide us towards research that actually makes differences. So I'm going to highlight a few things from my own living in this, and these aren't hard facts, so I very much hope that everyone listening will see this as an encouragement for discussion and dialogue afterwards, and I hope you'll pose some questions towards this, even critical questions as well. So when I was doing my studies at the University of Copenhagen, I was focused very much on biotechnology. I was a co-founder of the first biotechnological company in Greenland called Cold Science. And in Cold Science, we had 2 patented enzymes, Greenlandic cold adapted enzymes that could be used in industrial processes. And through that time, I was also a blogger at the Danish Engineers homepage and a public debater about all sorts of themes about Greenland. And I was a blogger there for 7 years. And the greatest focus of my blog and my public speaking was that I believed very much in the fact that we needed to utilize our land as we had done for 1,000 years, but we could also do this in modern ways, like through biotechnology. Biotechnology is when you go out and you find tiny little tools that nature has made and you earn money on those. And back then, I felt that that might be a great way of utilizing Greenland and our land rather than oil exploitation or mining. And it's not to say that I don't think that biotechnology has a place in Greenland any longer, but I have moved away from that way of thinking a lot since then. And I think there are a lot of other things that we need to do that are much more urgent and important before we start focusing on how we can earn money on biotechnological tools from Greenland. So what happened was that after my PhD, I had been living in Denmark then for about 20 years, moved to Denmark when I was 10 with my family, and then after my PhD wanted to move back to Greenland, and I had the opportunity to do that in 2017 to start a postdoc project that I called the Greenland Diet Revolution Project. And in the Greenland Diet Revolution Project, what I wanted to do was to look into the microbial communities of our foods that are distinguished by being animal sourced, but also sourced from the environment, or made in the environment, made in the land, on the land, in nature. And I had this thought that eating foods from nature would give a lot of interesting, a high diversity of microbes. I'm a microbiologist, and in microbiology today, one of the most important topics that's research is I can see that my internet connection is a little bit unstable. I hope that I come through okay. So in microbiology today, a very important topic is our intestinal ecosystems, our gut microbiomes, as we call them. Inside our bodies and on our bodies, we have microbes that are very important to our health. And with the industrialization of our food systems, it's believed that we've lost a lot of this microbial diversity. And I believe that eating a traditional diet of foods that have been made in nature is a way to sustain a healthy internal ecosystem. So we moved back to Greenland, and I worked there for the past 3 years. I've since then moved back to Copenhagen again. But through those 3-4 years in Greenland, the focus of my research, how I conduct my research, has changed a lot. And I want to highlight a few things from that research. So one of the objects of my research was the dried capelin, this fish that you see in the middle of this traditional Greenlandic food plate. In Greenlandic, we call it MSEC. And the capelin arrives and spawns on the coast. And they arrive around, and then you go out and you catch hundreds and maybe even thousands of them, and you dry them to store for the winter time. And when we eat them whole, including everything, their bones, their stomachs, everything is eaten from the dried capelin. And one of the results from looking at the dried capelin was that I could conclude that traditionally dried capelin have a high diversity of microbes. So I'm just going to bring one tiny piece of microbial result, and I hope you'll bear over with me. I'm going to go through it really quickly. It's not difficult to understand once it's explained, although it's a quite busy figure, I realize. So each column is a particular dried fish. So this one, for instance, I hope you can see my cursor. It says crowberry here because it's a dried fish that was dried on crowberry. And within that column, it says how large a fraction of a certain type of microbe is in that dried fish. So this particular dried fish had about 60% also of this green type of microbes called proteobacteria. And then there's a different kind of microbe colored yellow, and a different kind orange, and a different kind again blue. So what I want you to notice are these three columns over here that are completely green. And those three columns are the industrially dried capelin. So from our results, we could see that it's true that when you eat capelin dried in the environment, on the land, you are ingesting a much higher diversity of microbes than when you've eaten industrially produced capelin. And it's not the same thing as saying that those pink-colored microbes are super healthy for us, and that's why you should eat traditionally dried capelin. That we need a lot more research to be able to say that. But at least now we can see for our traditional foods in Greenland, when you eat from the land, you are feeding yourself a larger diversity of microbes, and that might influence our intestinal ecosystems. So another result that came from looking into the dried capelin was that dried capelin is a potential source of propionate. And propionate is an interesting molecule because in the field of the human gut microbiome, in the research about our intestinal ecosystems, one of the points that have really been cemented is that one of the reasons that our microbes are healthy for us, that they are important to us, is because when we eat plants, when we eat indigestible fiber found in plants, those fiber go down into our stomachs and microbes start degrading those. And from that process, we get certain molecules called short chain fatty acids. And propionate is a certain type of a short chain fatty acid, and it has different important functions in our bodies. We're not able to degrade plants on our own. We need the microbes to do that. One of the functions that propionate has, at least it's hypothesized, that it makes us feel full. And this was really interesting because in doing my research, a lot of the people I talked to came up with this point that when we eat imported foods in Greenland, we don't feel full. We feel full from eating our own foods, our local foods. And when I saw this, this result popping up that there were microbes in the capelin that might be able to produce propionate, I looked into the literature a little bit, and I found that fed people with diabetes or suffering from obesity, fed them cows of propionate. This is a very classic scientific approach that you try to understand the specific role that a molecule plays in your body, and the way that you use that knowledge is to get a pharmaceutical product that someone can earn money on, which might alleviate some of the health issues that we see today. But knowing that people feel more full from eating our own foods, and realizing that
I think, are you back on now? No, we are having some technical internet connection difficulties. Aviaya, if you are speaking up, I think we have unfortunately lost her. We will give one moment to see if she is able to reconnect. So thank you for bearing with us as everyone knows, working from home where digital connectivity is not necessarily equitable across the world, and particularly across the Arctic, can be difficult. But it looks like Aviaya is back on now.
Yes, I'm so sorry.
No, please don't apologize.
I wonder how long you did not hear.
It was only a moment, I think, before you realized that you had cut off. So I think we heard most of it. And then I think once you cut out or became unstable, you mentioned that you were unstable.
All right. So I wonder, Victoria, could you let me know if I was talking about propionate when I was shut off?
You were.
Okay. Yeah, I'm so sorry about that. So I actually have no idea how far I was. So I'm just going to go ahead and just recap that part. So propionate is important because it plays a role in our bodies. And one of the roles that it's supposed to play is that it makes us feel full. And in the work that I've done around our foods, one thing that I've consistently heard is that people don't feel full from imported foods, from Western foods. People feel full from our own foods, from Greenland. And just seeing this result that it might that this fish might contain propionate made me look into the literature, the research literature around propionate. And I came across a study that tried to feed people capsules with propionate, people who were suffering, I think, from diabetes or severe obesity, to help them feel full. And this is a classic reductionist approach to research and science, that we try to find out what a certain molecule does in our bodies, and then we use that fact to create products for the pharmaceutical industry to earn money on, to alleviate some of these health issues that we have because we're not eating the right things. And I don't believe that we'll have a healthier population if we have to feed ourselves capsules of propionate. We believe that food is medicine, and this highlights that if you understand how human beings have gotten propionate from eating a diet we're supposed to eat, that is understanding those facts in its context. And the reason that I realized this at all was because I talked to Agara from Qartason. So Agara was kind to send me dried capelin, dried on crowberry. And he knew I was interested in the traditionally dried crowberry. And then he sent me a different kind of capelin as well. And he said in Greenlandic, they taste better than the ones that I dry on crowberry. They have a better salty taste. And these particular dried capelin are capelin dried by the environment, really, not by human beings. They wash up on the shore and then they lie there and dry. And if I had been only focused on the microbiology of this research, and if I had not been having longer talks with him, trying to understand what he found interesting about dried capelin, I would not have seen this particular result, because I would not have compared the dried capelin from the shore to the other kinds of capelin, and I would not have seen that those capelin have a potential to produce propionate. So this is also just to illustrate that just seeing in a tunnel in our own fields of research really closes our minds to a lot of important understanding. So this is part of what makes me think, at least, that when we create facts, when we create knowledge, we have to do that in the context, with a deep understanding of the context of those facts. And that's how we create understanding of things. So final thing from the dried capelin, I love the dried capelin, obviously, is that it has an incredibly high content of calcium, 1100 milligrams per 100 grams of dried fish. This is because we eat it, including its bones, that contain high amounts of calcium. And this is important to know because in Greenland, this is in Danish, and I'm sorry about that, but this is in Greenland, this is the recommendation that we give children or parents to children. It's part of a booklet for families that tells parents what they should feed their children to make their children live a healthy life. And it says milk is healthy. And it says milk is the most important supplier of calcium, and every day the child must have half a liter of calcium. What it doesn't say here is that half of the population in Greenland is lactose intolerant, including the children. So half of the children, so for half of the children, milk isn't healthy. Milk makes them feel really uncomfortable. But still, in our diet recommendations in Greenland, we recommend milk. And this is very much an example of fact and knowledge out of context. This is not appropriate in an Arctic context. This is not appropriate in an Inuit context. And if we had looked into the context about how calcium is found, how healthy foods look like in Greenland, we could have highlighted the capelin instead. And the capelin has almost 10 times the amount of calcium per gram compared to milk. So this is why I think that science and research really has a great potential. And when it is put in the right context and is creating understanding, we can actually create positive, relevant change. One of those changes could be to change our diet recommendations in Greenland to include the dried capelin rather than milk, for instance. And these are small examples, but there are plenty of different examples of how, if we create facts in the right context, we can create positive change. And as Opik said, I mean, if we're not mindful with the research that we do, we are actually at the risk of creating more harm than we do good. And this is essentially also the point here. So another part of my research, which is the main focus of what I do today, are Inuit fermented foods. And diving into the world of our fermented foods has been really educational for me. It's been a way to understand that we cannot think and understand only within our own scientific disciplines. We really need to expand our minds to understand Inuit fermented foods, for instance. So if you look up the literature, scientific literature about our fermented foods, there will be a lot about food safety issues around these foods. And there are some pretty complicated food safety issues around Inuit fermented foods. But this has not been the focus of my research. From the beginning, it has been the focus of my research to understand the role that these foods play to us, how they are important, how they are healthy. But as a scientist and as a microbiologist, I cannot ignore that other area of research that states that there are some food safety issues also around these foods. And so there will be a scientific community in food safety who will say that these foods are dangerous, and that is the conclusion on those foods. It even says so in my clinical microbiology curriculum, like the book that I read when I was studying, that microbiologists can never recommend anyone to eat fermented seal flipper. And that, of course, is nonsense, because there's a reason that people eat seal flipper. And coming from the other side, from the scientific field of the human gut microbiome, we're much more acknowledging of the fact that fermented foods might play an important role to our health. And having to juggle and merge these two areas And also not even just in microbiology, but in all, just understanding the culture, understanding how these foods are important to us requires not just being able to acknowledge several facts at once, but also including understandings that I might not have, but someone else has, and respecting that, even though I might not fully understand. So inert fermented foods is really an arena that forces us to break down barriers between perspectives and between scientific disciplines. So I will just re-highlight the 3 points that I made in the beginning. I believe that the ceiling that we need to break in Arctic research is that we need to stop creating facts and start creating understanding, so that we can actually, so that research is directed in a way that it creates positive and relevant change. And we do that by breaking down a lot of the barriers that we have between human beings, between academia and non-academia, between scientific disciplines. And it's not a straightforward thing to do. So I brought a few examples. I hope Jessica is still here, because she is part of a research cluster that has been a way for me to try and do this. So we have a research cluster called the Radical and Relational Approaches to Fermentation and Food Sovereignty, where we are 4 women coming from different fields, different places, both in Native American studies and Indigenous studies and feminist science and microbiology, where we work with the same things and try to enhance each other and to create bigger understanding around inert fermented foods. And another way that I've tried to break down some of these barriers is this example over here. It's a photo of me and Menumina, and this is my brother Daniel, David Hauptmann. I was doing a project about Givial, fermented seabirds in northern Greenland, and I brought along my colleague Menumina, who's a historian and social anthropologist, because it is not enough to understand our foods from a microbiological perspective. I needed someone with a completely different kind of expertise to be able to support my microbiological research, and hopefully we'll be able to create a project around fermented seabirds that is respectful to fermented foods in the way that I want it to be. So these are some of the ways that we can break down barriers, is interacting with and including people from other disciplines and from other places. And then I also wanted to highlight that, I mean, this is by no means my expertise. These are just some observations that I've made through my research, but there are Indigenous scholars who have done great work to actually try and move us in more respectful directions with our research methodology. And one of the examples is Joanne Archibald, who has created the Indigenous storywork principles that you can use for your research. And those principles are respect and responsibility, reverence, reciprocity, relatedness, and synergy. And the first 4 principles are very much about how we conduct ourselves as researchers, while the last 3 principles are more about how we perceive the world. And when we take a reductionist approach to things, we do not see how things are part of a whole. We do not see how things are related. We do not see that things are part of something that creates synergy. So we lose something when we work within our own scientific disciplines only. And I hope that comes across a little bit also from the examples that I've highlighted today. And then there's another Indigenous scholar who has written this piece called "What is an Indigenous Research Methodology?" And I want to bring forward a quote from that. So one major difference between the dominant paradigms in research and an Indigenous paradigm is that the dominant paradigms build on the fundamental belief that knowledge is an individual entity. The researcher is an individual in search of knowledge. Knowledge is something that is gained, and therefore knowledge may be owned by an individual. And this is very spot on the foundation of biotechnology, because biotechnology is only valuable when we patent something. And patenting is, per definition, owning of knowledge, and earning money on owning that knowledge. So the rest of the quote goes that an indigenous paradigms come from the fundamental belief that knowledge is relational. Knowledge is shared with all of creation. It is not just interpersonal relationship, not just with the research subjects I may be working with, but it is a relationship with all of creation. It is with the cosmos, it is with the animals, with the plants, with the earth that we share this knowledge. And other than being a really beautiful quote, I wanted to bring this also to say that this has been a process for me, and it will continue to be a process for me. And I might by now be at a stage where I can really see that I fully acknowledge that knowledge is also relational, in the sense that it's about interpersonal relationships. I'm not fully at a place to say that I understand what it means that it is with the earth that we share this knowledge. It is with the plants and the animals. Not to say that I don't agree with it. It's just I don't fully understand that yet. And maybe I will someday. So I hope this can serve as an encouragement for some dialogue and discussion now. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope that I wasn't falling out too much.
Thank you. Not at all. If everyone can join me again in giving a huge virtual applause, and any words in the chat, which I am seeing coming in, for a incredible presentation that was both so informative and such a journey. And I think that made it so accessible, which I really appreciate. Thank you. We do have about 10 minutes for questions. So as a reminder, if you have questions, please put them in the chat or go down to the participant icon and raise your hand so that I can unmute you, and you can come on and make a comment. We do have a question that they hope is not too personal, but are there any changes you and your family have made within your own diets to address gut biology?
That's a really great question, and it's certainly something that you think about when that is your field of research. And I do work with gut microbiomes as well, not just with our foods. I mean, we try to eat fresh foods mostly, and moving recently from Nuuk, Greenland to Copenhagen, Denmark has really changed our diets a lot. In Greenland, we would eat a lot of fish, which is not something that I do because of gut microbiome reasons. But I think what I would say in connection to this is that I've only through my research, I've become more and more convinced with what I went into the research with, the idea that plants aren't the basis of all healthy diets. And in gut microbiome research, at least, plants definitely serve as the one most important recommendation for having a healthy gut microbiome. And I don't believe that. So we have a pretty high protein diet in our home. And I continue to believe that that is good for our gut health as well.
Thank you. We have another question from the live stream, and this is specific for early career and maybe PhD students. So it can be difficult to work within a colonial structure in academia, trying to do this type of work. Do you have any suggestions or recommendations if you find yourself in a PhD program wanting to push past this?
That is, yeah, very, very important question. And I think while Akbik was talking, I thought there were so many topics that I could have gone into that could have highlighted much more connection between what I do and what she does. And this is one of the things, education and trying to make a career and doing that with a research approach that you feel is respectful to the people that you work with, the person that you are, can be challenging. And I mean, I will just say that I do experience that there are institutions that are not fully developed to understand these issues properly yet, but that a lot of these issues, like if you want to take a decolonial approach to your research, there are ways to do that where you can talk about it in ways that is also understandable to someone for whom a decolonizing approach isn't in their mindset. I mean, it's about how you frame it and where you direct the communication. So I think there are ways to frame most projects so that it can be a respectful decolonizing project, but it can be articulated in a way that's understandable to most people. But it's a challenge, and it requires some extra time. And for anyone wanting to do that, I can just really recommend that you find mentors who fully understand you and can help you frame things and send you in the direction that you want to go. Because it's very important who your supervisors are or what mentors you can have beyond your supervisors.
Yeah, that mentorship point is so important. And we will, in the follow-up, also share some resources as well, if you want to think more and read more about these issues. We have one more question. Asking, do you have any statistics on how food consumption has changed historically? And maybe even if not statistics, just generally, how food consumption has changed historically.
Yeah, so since so in recent generations, we have had the public health survey that has made the statistics on this. So the public health survey, a lot of their reports can be found online, and I could share the links with you afterwards. And what you can see in those reports are several things. One thing that I find very important is that if you're an Inuit person from Greenland, you know that your local foods are healthy, your indigenous foods are healthy. If you're a Danish person living in Greenland, you do not necessarily agree with this. So this is one thing that I've been working with a lot, trying to communicate that we have very different perceptions of what healthy diets are depending where we were born, what parents we grew up with, and this is impacting our food situation in Greenland a lot. Another piece of result from the public health survey is that we've gone more and more away from our traditional foods, and with that we have had an incredible increase in diabetes and other non-communicable diseases. And it's very well acknowledged that the farther away we've moved from our traditional diets, the more of these public health concerns we see. And for further back, you would need to look into things that aren't necessarily found in PDF versions. So in Greenland, we have the Danish journal called Meddelelser om Grønland, and in that has been a lot of also documenting of our diets and how they've changed since early 1900s and onwards.
Thank you. And for our final question, I am going to call back on our first speaker. Akpik, do you want to ask your question?
Oh my goodness, thank you so much for your presentation. Everybody. I learned a lot, and I actually see so many connections, even though it might seem so different. I was just like, yeah, so many things. But my question is, one of the things that we've faced up here in our communities, because we're coastal and we also eat a lot of marine mammals, and now your presentation is making my tummy rumble. But we have seen, because of climate change, a lot of persistent organic pollutants that are getting into some of our mammals that we consume. And we've had a hard time in the public health arena to advocate and say that it's still healthier for us to consume these foods than it is to have store-bought foods. And so I'm wondering if you have suggestions on how to have that conversation or to point out, because it's been really hard for research in some of our smaller communities to advocate that this is still the best food line for them, despite these things being found in our marine life. So I was just wondering your kind of advice, or if you have something that might be useful for that conversation we're having over here.
Thank you, Alfie, for that so important question, and it's very much at the core of a lot of the work that I want to do and that I've been doing with great colleagues from Greenland, because this is like at the heart of, like I highlighted other points, but this could have been the point that I highlighted, that knowledge and facts is like measuring the amount of PCB or PAH, other different kinds of persistent organic pollutants, or mercury or lead or cadmium in our foods, and not realizing how that impacts the narrative around our foods. And as I just said before, we know that with the divergence from our traditional foods, we've become increasingly unhealthy. And there's very limited knowledge about what these pollutants are doing to us. But at least it's not the pollutants that have created our public health issues. It is moving away from our traditional foods that have created our public health issues. And in Greenland, we are at the same spot as you are, maybe even at a worse stage, because there's one report about the nutritional value of our foods, and the very first sentence in that report has to do with contaminants. It doesn't have to do with selenium or with vitamins or anything like that. It has to do with contaminants. So our foods are framed in this Arctic dilemma. How do we balance the potential hazards and benefits from our foods? But there's really, I mean, the balance is about how do we prevent ourselves from eating all the unhealthy imported foods. And so just knowing the data for me helps. So Canada, Harriet Kuhnlein has, and people that have worked with her have created a massive amount of reports and scientific publications around the nutritional value and cultural value. And that's the other thing. I mean, in these discussions, we're not even talking about the broader and much more valid health concept that is also going hunting, preparing foods, being with your family, and all of these things. We're only talking about nutritional value, which is still a very reductionist approach. But even looking just at that, there are great arguments to eat our local foods, and there are reports out there, and I would point to Canada and Canadian researchers for that, because we have not been excellent at that in Greenland, and hopefully that will change. But thank you so much for that question.
Thank you. And as we are at about time, again, I just want to invite everyone to please join me one final time. Aviaya Akpik, thank you so much for being, again, so generous with your expertise and your time today. I think I can speak in all of our cheering virtually and our comments that everyone so appreciated it. So thank you so much. And
thank you all.
And for those who just can't get enough of our Breaking the Ice Ceiling webinar series, we have another webinar on April 19th, bringing together two incredible women from Alaska and Russia. And we will be learning about meaningful research in the wildlife management and natural resource co-management as an Indigenous woman, and about CO2 in Siberian boreal forests. So again, two different topics, but like we learned today, there are so many connections that need to be made across borders, across disciplines, and we hope that bringing together women in these webinars that we can do that and expand the conversation. So again, thank you for joining us today. We hope to see you on April 19th, and I hope that you have a wonderful, wonderful early spring day wherever you are in the world. Thank you all, and